webinar providing an update on the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act. My name is Miko Lindberg, and I am the Education Policy Analyst with the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we begin, let me mention that our audience is in listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question, please type it in the question box on the GoToWebinar toolbar. You may do so at any time during the webinar. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible before the end of our program. Please also note that we will be recording this event, and it will be available online at the CSG Knowledge Center at www.knowledgecenter.csg.org and on the SLC website at www.slcatlanta.org. As a quick recap, since April 2015, Congress has been working diligently on rewriting the Federal Elementary and Secondary Education Act, last authorized in 2001 as the No Child Left Behind Act, or NCLB. On July 8th, the U.S. House of Representatives, with a very close vote, passed the Student Success Act, introduced by Representative Kline of Minnesota. 8 days later, the U.S. Senate passed a bipartisan compromise forged by Senator Lamar of Tennessee and Senator Patty Murray of Washington, named the Every Child Achieves Act. The House and the Senate versions of the ESEA rewrite have much in common, but diverge on a few critical issues such as school choice, accountability, and student opt-outs for national testing. By the end of July, the conference process to create the House and Senate compromise was underway, but much of the work remained on the table. In September, Congress returned from a 5-week recess ready to work on ESEA, but were stymied by the overwhelming priority of the federal budget. Once work on ESEA continues, finding a middle ground for both chambers and one that will receive a presidential signature could prove challenging. This webinar will provide a briefing on the history of ESEA, details on the transformation of federal education policy by NCLB, an update on the key ESEA differences currently being debated, and insights into what long-standing implications the new federal education policies will have for state governments. In that vein, our first speaker today is Christopher Cross of Cross and Justice. Chris is a former Assistant Secretary for Educational Research and Improvement at the U.S. Department of Education and former President of the Maryland State Board of Education. Chris is a noted author and expert on the federal role in education and serves on numerous high-profile advisory boards. He joins us today in his role as Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Education Commission of the States and will be providing a historical perspective of ESEA since its adoption in 1965. Our second speaker is Professor Patrick McGuinn, Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Drew University and Senior Research Specialist at the Consortium for Policy Research in Education. Pat's first book, No Child Left Behind and the Transformation of Federal Education Policy, 1965 to 2005, published in 2006, was honored as a Choice Outstanding Academic title, and he has since continued with an intense interest in further research in the federal education policy. Given his expertise, Pat will be providing an overview of the huge changes and successes of NCLB and the shortcomings that ultimately led to the need for another rewrite. Our third and final speaker is Nick Jacobs, Budget and Policy Analyst at the Federal Funds Information for States, or FFIS. Founded by the National Governors Association and the National Conference of State Legislatures, FFIS helps states manage their federal funds by analyzing the impact of federal actions on states. Nick has been following and publishing research in relation to the ESEA rewrite process since its beginning, and most recently prepared a thorough comparison piece on the funding and formula grant changes created by the House and Senate ESEA bills, which he will be sharing with us today. With those introductions, I will now turn it over to Mr. Christopher Cross.
Yes, good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. What I'd like to do is briefly run through some of the background and history of ESEA, because I think as we say from a historical perspective, the situation of why we're here today where we are is really important to understanding the issues that are facing us. So if we can move on to the next slide here, is going back a few centuries to the quote from Cicero, "The causes and events are ever more interesting than the events themselves. What I'm going to try and do this afternoon is to cover briefly some of those events that have preceded the situation we face today in education and why some of those issues are still with us. So if we go back then for the beginning of ESEA, which as everybody knows is in 1965, past the 50th anniversary of that not long ago. There are a lot of issues that have shaped the federal role in education. In fact, even before ESEA, the first major federal legislation was the National Defense Education Act. Notice that it was about education, but it was called the National Defense Act. And it came out of the launching by the Soviet Union of that little tiny satellite called Sputnik, and the galvanizing effect that had on the American society in terms of recognizing that we're behind in areas like math, science, engineering, and foreign language. So that caused the creation of a law that preceded ESEA. And it's fair to say, I think, that the ESEA and in many cases most of the legislation since then, major factors, have frankly been caused by the failure of states to act to address issues. ESEA was famously part of the war on poverty and was aimed at rectifying what was seen as the imbalance in resources and access to quality education across the country, and particularly in poor districts. So when Johnson signed the bill in 1965 in Texas, it was in front of his old one-room schoolhouse where he had taught, and was a sign of trying to address the gaps that achieved. And of course, since then, the economy, international competitiveness, and the whole question of maintaining our position in the world have been driving factors in this regard. Now, there are a number of issues here in the next slide which also deal with some of the background here. Many of you may be in states and districts where there are lots of federal installations, and they are covered by what you see here as the Impact Aid Act, which both preceded and followed World War II and the Korean War to provide just general aid for districts where a lot of property was off the rolls, the tax rolls locally. The Smith-Hughes Act actually goes back to at the end of World War I, when it was discovered that an amazing, something over half of the people who were tested to be in the military failed the tests. So the result was they created what is now the Perkins Act, although it's gone through many differences since then. And then we've talked about the National Defense Education Act in '65. So moving forward then, what we see is that, let's move forward here. Yeah. There are a number of issues that, of course, affected the creation of ESEA and really created the situation around it. The Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954 sat there and was not much done with it and implementing it until the Civil Rights Act of '64. And issues of busing have been there from the time of ESEA through later iterations of the bill, although it's in the last 3 or 4 iterations from the '80s on, not as much of an issue. No Child Left Behind, of course, came into law actually in 2002. The bill is called the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, but the president didn't actually sign it until 2002. And it was meant to address some of what was felt were some of the lingering issues from the race and civil rights perspective that had not been addressed by the War on Poverty and by Title I and other earlier acts. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, of course, came in '75 and is another predicate to federal legislation today. But the issues around closing the achievement gap, providing more resources, and dealing with some of the effects of poverty, some of the major effects, particularly of concentrated poverty, have been issues that are guiding still today, having been initiated in the Johnson administration, again, a half century before. So moving forward here, in the civil rights area, we can see we had not only IDEA in '75, but Title IX, which is the title of the '72 Higher Education Act, which deals really with the ability of women and men to access programs across the board, but was really aimed at the gap around the availability of things like sports and athletics to women. Was enacted in '72. We had in '75 and IDEA, which we mentioned, and then NCLB was really seen as a continuation by the advocates in 2001 when this was negotiated as a continuation of the civil rights thrust, and particularly the issue of providing access and availability to students around the country. If you look back at who the key architects of that bill were and look at their speeches, everyone from President Bush to Senator Ted Kennedy, you'll find that that was the overriding issue that confronted them in enacting that bill. So moving forward, so here's an example of the federal actions that have been triggered by states not meeting the needs of students as seen by the federal government. And Congress moves in. If there's a void, Congress will move in and address it. And that's what we've seen. Now, in the last several years, we've also seen that this has been an area where the executive branch has moved in and taken what Congress enacted and taken it much further forward, and we'll be talking about that further this morning. But the areas that you see here, vocational education, Title I, which is the major part of ESEA, IDEA, programs for the gifted, and then the Race to the Top legislation, of course, which grew out of the act to try and deal with the recession, when great amounts of money were put into the education system, including money for the Race to the Top, which gave the U.S. Secretary of Education tremendous discretion. The authorizing statute on that is part of the economy bill, but it's very brief and gave to the Secretary almost total discretion to do what he's done, although there are arguments about waiver authorities and the rest. So moving forward, then there are several issues here which I've highlighted, 6 of them, which I think are going to affect future education policy. First is federalism. I've just finished reading the book by Joseph Ellis called Quartet, which talks about the federalism debates at the time of the writing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And it's well worth a read, because from that you can see the same federalism issues which were there 225 years ago are still there in many ways today. What is the proper role of states? What's the proper role of the federal government? What's the capacity of each? Education as a civil right is now, I think, in the forefront of the agenda for many, many people. Second chance options remain. This is a country we're reminded more frequently right now of immigrants, and that means that second chance to always improve are going to remain there. free markets as a subject that has really come forward in the last decade or more, and that's we've seen emerge in many, many states, including Georgia in the South, Louisiana, many, many states in terms of that. And the centralization versus flexibility. How do you deal with those contrasting issues as well as meeting the needs above? And then is the role of scientifically based evidence and how that will be portrayed in law and in fact. So moving forward then, there are several observations that I would make and then quickly turn to Patrick. First is when you look at federal law, there is the issue of the importance of people at the state and local level being able to say, quote, they made me do it. In other words, it would be hard to gain necessarily the momentum to do something locally, but the feds have come in and said you have to do it. Secondly is the need, I think, to do away with siloization. I know that's a coined term, but I think you can quickly understand it's the many different chimneys that have developed, and we're now to the point where they're probably counterproductive. The governance of education is really important, and at the state level, who is controlling the question of the role of state boards, governors, legislatures, and the state superintendent or commissioner is often very, very ambiguous. And then we have the issue of authority being ceded to the executive branch, and then relationships not being very recognized as being as important as they need to be in terms of achieving policy. So finally, a couple of publications to mention to you. If we can have the last slide. There is a book that I've written on the whole question of setting the course for state and federal policy called Political Education. You'll see it here. And then I did a publication for ECS a few months ago called The Progress of Education Reform, the Shaping of Education Policy, Federal Policy Over Time. And you'll see the links here to get those. The ECS report is about 8 pages and gives you much of the history here. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleagues.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Cross, for that informative historical background and those observations. As a reminder to our participants, we are saving our questions until the end of the webinar. We'll now turn it over to our next presenter, Professor Pat McWinn.
Well, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation to speak with you. Chris just gave us a wonderful tour through, well, over 50 years of history of federal education policy and how we end up with No Child Left Behind. And he ended his presentation with a plug for his book, and I'll start my presentation with a plug for mine. You can never miss an opportunity to plug a book. But what I try to do in this book is essentially trace the dynamics and the evolutions of federal policy that Chris outlined. And it's really pretty remarkable when you think about how far we've come from the ESEA of 1965 to No Child Left Behind. You know, in a country that, as Chris noted with federalism, has traditionally had a very strong sense of limited federal government's role in policy generally, and in education in particular, a really strong emphasis on states' rights and local control of schools. So it's really a dramatic, I think, revolution in federal policy by the time you get to No Child Left Behind. So if we can go to the next slide, please. We're now in a place which is interesting to point out. We've had 4 presidents, the past 4 presidents, two Republican, George Herbert Walker Bush, and of course his son George W. Bush, and then Bill Clinton, and now President Obama, who really have embraced what I call the standards testing and accountability kind of model or frame as this bedrock for federal policy. So it's important to emphasize that this had bipartisan origins, particularly No Child Left Behind, and has bipartisan support, although, as I think we will hear from Nick later, that may be changing somewhat. One thing I think it's important to understand, No Child Left Behind is, I think, the big bang of federal policy. I think it's rightly viewed that way. It's an unprecedentedly ambitious and aggressive intervention by the federal government into education in the United States. But much of what is found in No Child Left Behind actually was laid down. The sort of foundation for it was laid down by President Clinton in 1994 with an earlier, the previous reauthorization of ESEA, which was at that time termed the Improving America's School Act. And so I think it's important to understand that this didn't emerge whole cloth out of No Child Left Behind, but was more of an iterative kind of evolutionary process. As Chris alluded to, and as the cover picture of my book there with Ted Kennedy and John Boehner and George W. Bush intimates, this was a bipartisan bill as it came out of the Congress by numbers that we would find very shocking to see, certainly in the contentious Congress of today. But 381 to 41 in the House and 87 to 10 in the Senate. And Chris mentioned this, but it's important to understand that both parties are really kind of getting behind education reform and a more aggressive federal role in education reform, but for somewhat different reasons. On the left, there was a real concern about closing these large and persistent racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps in the name of promoting better equal opportunity and more equal outcomes in education. And on the right, there was a real concern, particularly in the business community, about what they saw as sort of inadequate workforce preparation coming out of our K-12 schools. So you get these left and right kind of coming together in this. You get dramatically increased federal role and also dramatically increased federal spending. And of course, it's the federal spending that is what has been used to leverage getting states to sign on to the mandates of NCLB because the federal government doesn't have that kind of direct command power in education. The word education is not even mentioned in the U.S. Constitution. So what are the mandates in NCLB? First of all, states need to have academic standards for all students. Perhaps most significantly, they need to have yearly proficiency tests in English language arts and math in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school, and also testing in science and across 3 different grade spans. They need to make adequate yearly progress, or what's called AYP, with the goal of states making progress every year towards the ultimate goal of having all of their students be proficient by 2014. Obviously, that date has come and gone, and we certainly didn't get there. In fact, remain a long way from there, and we'll hear more about that later. Also significant was a requirement that states release this student test score data. They make these public report cards available to parents in a way that was pretty historically unprecedented, and that they take all of that data that they're collecting and they disaggregate it based on subgroups. So in particular, the groups of disadvantaged populations that we feel have been being underserved by state control of education, needs unmet, as Chris alluded to, that for English language learners, for special needs children, for African American students, for Latino students, that their numbers be broken out, separated out from the averages of their schools, so we could really shine a spotlight on where those students were performing or not performing. Then what's called a cascade of remedies attached to this, that states have to act for the schools that are not making adequate yearly progress. And that cascade of remedies then became more intensive as schools continued to not show performance. So you start out with a public school choice option, supplemental educational services, which really meant tutoring for the most part, and corrective action, and then ultimately restructuring of schools in supposedly a more serious way. So this, again, the Fed's really pushing the states to take action for these consistently poor performing schools in a way that historically they had not done so, and that states had been often reluctant to do so. A provision in there about highly qualified teachers, which was thought to be very significant. It doesn't end up being so much so under NCLB. States really are able to sort of define that away, but it does initiate a conversation about human capital element in education, which is we've now certainly come back to. And of course, non-compliance means you lose federal money. So the federal government really said you have to do this. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is just a nice visual that I like, right? Uncle Sam, I want no child left behind. Again, speaking to the historically unusual, unprecedented role that the federal government is taking here. If we can move on to the next slide, please. And again, the contrast between the original ESEA of 1965 and NCLB of 2001-2002 is really quite striking. ESEA, the original, narrowly targeted, really focused just on disadvantaged students and focused on school inputs, really resources, really not a focus on outputs at all there. Contained few federal mandates, was not terribly prescriptive beyond reporting kinds of requirements. NCLB, on the other hand, addresses all schools and students. Very clearly focused on school outputs as measured by achievement on tests. Remarkably prescriptive, as I mentioned, in terms of the sort of school, the AYP process and the school turnaround process. And this, leaves us in a place where I and others have started to talk about a sort of a national school marm for better and worse. And I'll talk about the better and the worse in a second. Next slide, please. I like this picture. This is not photoshopped. This is an actual picture. The big behemoth building in the background is the U.S. Department of Education main office in Washington, D.C., and hulking over what is a facsimile was put up. This was literally put up in front of the Department of Education of the little red schoolhouse. And so I like the juxtaposition of sort of, in the foreground where American education started, and now with No Child Left Behind, this very different role for the federal government lurking over them. If we can go to the next slide, please. So successes, I think a lot of people refer to NCLB as a tainted brand, quote unquote, now, and certainly you hear much discussion of how NCLB was a failure as a law. I think that's true to a degree, as I'll comment on next, but I think the law did have a number of important successes, and that's part of why the debate now over reauthorizing ESEA and what will be the successor to NCLB, I think is so contentious. There are a lot of people who don't simply want to get rid of NCLB and want to preserve what they see as positive elements of the federal policy. So the first, and I think this may in fact be the most important legacy, better data and transparency of outcomes, and again, disaggregated data, that being very important to sort of the anti-poverty and civil rights community as they fight for equity, right? And that the transparency in this data is in and of itself a form of accountability. The greater public and media and politician, I think, awareness, policymaker awareness of the problems in education have really been highlighted by NCLB and by all of this data. Again, in particular, the racial and socioeconomic achievement gaps that are so pervasive and so damaging to equity in the United States. Again, that subgroup disaggregation and accountability for subgroup performance, not just the performance of average students in the school, which can really hide a lot of how disadvantaged populations are not performing inside of school and at schools, and holding folks accountable for that. That was something that really didn't exist by and large in the United States prior to NCLB. The federal government's increased role in education has really forced states and state education agencies to take on an increased role and to try to build their capacity to generate school improvement in their states. And the federal governments have really pushed states to take on a greater role, where historically really education was much more of a local affair. And at least from the standpoint of equity, many people think this is a good development. A focus on school turnarounds. I'm right down the road from Newark here, which of course is the source of much controversy and attention lately. But in places like Newark in the United States and all across the country, we had schools that really had failed just generations of kids, particularly in our urban areas, also in some rural areas. And these schools, there was never really any serious effort to take radical steps to improve these schools and give the kids in these schools a better education. With NCLB, they might not have been the right remedies, they may not have all been effective, but there was at least an effort to really try to get serious about the school turnaround issue. Expanded choice comes out of NCLB. I mentioned the public school choice transfer option. You begin to see charter schools beginning to kind of grow in part as a result of NCLB, even more so as a result of Race to the Top. Of course, charter schools as a choice are controversial, but again, from an equity standpoint, many will say at least folks who were trapped in failing schools now begin to have alternative models and options. I think you see much more educational innovation and experimentation that comes out of NCLB in the wake of NCLB as people are really trying to develop new kinds of models to generate this improvement. In charter, certainly one example of that, but many others as well. Data-driven instruction and empirical research, all of this test score data that we begin to gather now and disaggregate isn't just good for transparency and information purposes, which it is, but it also is potentially a very useful tool for teachers so that they can better understand where their students are learning and where they are not, and how they might be able to be more effective in the classroom. And for researchers as well, a lot more data means we can really test hypotheses about in education about what works, what kinds of policies work and don't work. And as I said before, I think it really launches a long overdue discussion about teacher quality and how to enhance teacher quality and the distribution of quality teachers inside of the United States. Thank you. Go to the next slide, please. So the problems with NCLB, certainly plenty of problems as well. States are quite resistant and resentful to this, this coercive federal role and call for more flexibility in how to meet a lot of these mandates, and believe that the money that the federal government allocated to helping implement NCLB, while increased from previous ESEAs, was not adequate. States really struggle, particularly initially, to get these new testing and data systems in place. That's a pretty messy process and one that really varies in effectiveness across our 50 states. Obviously, NCLB by design leads to an increase in the frequency of testing in our classrooms and concerns about over-testing and teaching to the test and a narrowing of the curriculum. And there's also concern about the quality of the tests that are being given, and these sort of multiple choice kinds of bubble testing, whether they really are actually effectively measuring student achievement. One huge issue under NCLB was the gaming the system that went on in the name of federalism and states' rights. While NCLB required states to come up with standards and tests and proficiency definitions, it allowed each state to set its own standards, to come up with its own tests, come up with its own definition of proficiency. And in an era where they were going to be held accountable for the results, both initially and then particularly over time, there was a real incentive, a perverse incentive, for states to lower the bar rather than try to get students to reach a high bar that they would be held accountable for. So have weaker standards, have easier tests, have lower definitions of proficiency and the cut scores that students have to get on these tests. I mentioned states taking on a greater role, but clearly capacity issues in state education agencies, which continue to persist to this day. This was a new role that's kind of taking on a school improvement function rather than simply a compliance, kind of grant-making role that SEAs has historically had, and they're still struggling with, developing the capacity to help local school districts and schools. School restructuring loopholes. There's this language that gets inserted into NCLB sort of at the last minute that says after this list of kind of restructuring options, or any other major restructuring. What that means, of course, nobody knew. It's the option, not surprisingly, because it was the most flexible and vague that most schools actually took, and there's not much evidence that it actually, in fact, led to any serious restructuring in those poorly performing schools. This was a new role under NCLB for the U.S. Department of Education as well, and they have struggled with both how to sort of push states to implement and enforce implementation of NCLB's provisions on the one hand, but also try to help states with their own school improvement efforts. And again, the federal government has always struggled with this lack of command power. Essentially, it's using these categorical grants. They can threaten to pull the money back from these states, but given that most federal money goes to support not just education here, obviously, but also education, particularly of poor, minority, and disadvantaged kids, pulling that money back is often a difficult and harmful thing to do. David Cohen and others have argued that the law really focused a lot on ends, what states had to do, getting everybody to proficiency, but a lot less on how states were actually supposed to deliver on that result, and also that, again, by defining the goal as proficiency, what you do is you create a bar which encourages educators and policymakers in states to focus on those kids who are right above or right below the bar, because you don't get any points for moving a kid who's very far from the bar, almost to the bar but not above, and you don't get any bonus in the system for getting students who are already well above the bar further above the bar. So it creates this sort of bubble kids kind of strategy, and now we're really shifting the conversation to growth, right? We want all kids to grow and teachers to develop growth for all kids, not just getting them above an arbitrary proficiency standard. And then the final slide here, I'll try to lead into the next presentation. But out of all of this, some of the key issues for ESEA reauthorization, what in Washington is very technically called the loosey-tighty problem, which is this sense that NCLB kind of got it wrong and inverted by having the focus be on on kind of the means, but allowing the states to set the sort of the ends in terms of the standards and the testing and the proficiency definitions. That's what's led to a kind of a desire for national standards and assessments, a la the Common Core, but of course a whole host of issues around that. Federal accountability in both of the versions of the bills, I'm sure we'll hear more about in a second. It seems like federal accountability for states, in particular for these low-performing schools, is going to be kind of pushed back, which has led those equity concerns to kind of come back to the forefront again. Are states really going to take seriously, in a way they hadn't pre-NCLB, trying to improve educational opportunity in our most disadvantaged communities, absent federal pressure? Again, debates about standardized tests and their utility, and what other kinds of measures maybe we should incorporate into accountability and measuring student achievement. AYP and these kind of timetables for proficiency. Some argue we need them to kind of keep states driving the car forward and keep making progress. Others think that this is just utopian and they should just be either dropped entirely or extended. Teacher quality, again, we're just at the frontier of really addressing teacher quality issues in the United States. Surprise, surprise, the quality of our teachers is the single most important factor in our schools, and we know we don't yet have the teaching force that we want. So there's now kind of a new focus on education schools, teacher evaluation, tenure systems, and compensation systems around merit pay. Expanded learning time. We know we have among the shortest school day and school year in the industrialized world. Maybe expanded learning time. Preschool in New York and elsewhere has become a big issue now as well. And again, what do we do about school choice? Do we continue to push for the growth of charters, vouchers? There's a very contentious portability provision for Title I funding in the House bill. And I will end there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor McGuinn, for that insightful overview of NCLB. We'll now turn it over to our final presenter, Mr. Jacobs.
Thank you, Miko. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me today. The professor there had a great list of things that ESEA reauthorization really does have to tackle. Unfortunately, I will be talking about none of those things. I'm going to keep this short and give you a high-level summary of how the House's Student Success Act, H.R. 5, and the Senate's Every Child Achieves Act, S. 1177, may have on funding for grants to states. Okay, the next slide. So there's a lot of issues that need to be resolved going into conference. There's the structure of the bill, how many titles will be, accountability measures, testing, portability of funds, maintenance of effort. For example, H.R. 5 would remove all maintenance of effort requirements, whereas the Senate version doesn't, but would allow certain exceptions. Another big issue to cover is that the House bill provides specific dollar amounts for each of the programs, or some sort of percentage of a later dollar amount, whereas the Senate version authorizes such sums for just about everything. Another important issue is how long the bills will last. The House version lasts 4 years until 2019, and then the Senate version would last 6 years going on to 2021. But I'll be focusing on the last 3 bullets for this presentation. Okay, the next slide. So the important thing to understand when it comes to grants and ESEA is how important formula funding is. More than 2/3 of the grants authorized by ESEA are competitive, but those 50-some-odd programs comprise only about 6% of the total funding under ESEA, and most of those haven't even been funded in years, or if ever. The 2 largest grant programs, grants to LEAs and Title II Improving Teacher Quality, comprise more than 70% of all funding in ESEA. So any changes to the formulas for those 2 programs could have significant impacts on states. Next. So the House bill cuts a lot of programs, 56 programs, 19 of which were funded in fiscal year 2015, such as 21st Century Community Learning Centers, which is the 3rd largest grant program in the states, school improvement grants under Title I, which was a $500 billion program, and preschool development grants, formerly Race to the Top. In total, those 19 programs received more than $3.2 billion in in fiscal year 2015. Next slide. Next. There we go. So the House bill would authorize approximately $3 billion across 4 new grant programs. The lion's share of that money would fund 2 block grants, the local academic flexible grants and teacher and school leader flexible grants. Both of those block grant programs would allocate funding to states, and then states would sub-allocate those resources to LEAs in a competitive fashion. The larger of the 2 allocates funding to states based on their shares of the previous year's Title I Part A funding, so that's important to keep in mind. And then the teacher and school leader flexible grant uses shares of school-age child population. And then those 2 competitive grants, family engagement education, a very, very small program in comparison. And then there's the Schools of the Future Act, which is actually wouldn't be a part of ESEA proper. It would be its own little bubble. And the amount of funding that it gets is unclear because it doesn't actually authorize a specific dollar amount, nor does it say if such sum is necessary. It just says however much they feel like, essentially. But the focus of that program is school technology. Next. And then the Senate version, jumping over to S1177, would get rid of about 43 grants. 8 were funded in fiscal year 2015, which includes the preschool development grants, striving readers, math and science partnerships. In total, those programs received more than $750 million. In contrast to the House bill, the Senate version includes what appear to be direct replacements for all currently funded grant programs that it eliminates. Next slide. So the Senate version would authorize 12 new grant programs, 3 formula-based programs, and 9 competitive. You can find a full list of the new programs for the Senate bill in FFIS issue brief 1527. So lawmakers did not provide specific authorization levels for any of the new grant programs in this bill. They just said such sums as may be necessary. So it's really difficult to get a definitive answer on how much money is actually going to be spent or could be spent. The CBO's cost estimate for the bill suggests that these collection of grants could total possibly more than $1 billion in fiscal year 2016, but those are rough estimates. The 3 formula grants proposed by the Senate would make up probably about more than half of that amount. And then there's 3 grants. Innovative Technology Expands Children's Horizons, also known as ITech, would be based on each state's relative share of Title I grants to LEA's funding, which brings us to the next slide. So Title I Part A is the largest grant program in ESEA. That is it's a $4.4 billion program, and the way that it allocates funding to states is a blend of 4 formulas: basic, concentration, targeted, and education finance incentive grants. It's a mouthful. So the Senate would create a 5th formula called equity grants, which would be similar to education finance incentive grants with some minor tweaks. That new equity grants formula would only kick in for appropriations in excess of $17 billion. And so that's really important to understand that anything that could be changed, if this was included in the final bill, it would be very unlikely that it would take effect for several years because of that $17 billion threshold. It could be almost a decade before the program actually reaches that level of appropriations. But in any case, states in the South would benefit the most from the new formula because they have large shares of the population of children living in poverty and spend significantly less money than the national average per pupil expenditure, which is what this formula uses as its expenditure factor. Next. And so both bills would include some sort of change to Title II Part A grants, which is the second largest grant program in ESEA. The table there shows the components under current law, how the House would change it, and then the Senate's proposal. H.R. 5 would eliminate the base allotment, also known as the hold harmless provision, and give formula factors equal weight in the allocation of funds to states. So there would be equal weight to shares of population of school-age children living in poverty and just the general school-age children population. Whereas the Senate would gradually remove the hold harmless by each year an additional 14.29% until 2022, when there just wouldn't be a hold harmless anymore. And the Senate version would put additional weight onto each state's share of school-age children living in poverty. Next slide. So the states that would benefit the most are in the West and South because of their large populations of school-age children. And a fully phased-in Senate bill would be even more favorable because of its emphasis on children living in poverty. But the single driving factor when it comes to how these changes would affect allocations to states is the hold harmless factor. So the hold harmless factor under Title II Part A is that each state receives at least its relative shares of fiscal year 2001 funding for two expired programs, the Eisenhower Professional Development Grants and the Class Size Reduction Grants. So the effect of that is huge because that hold harmless accounted for 87% of fiscal year 2015 allocation. So there was a very small amount of money that was actually being allocated under the Title II Part A formula as it is now under No Child Left Behind. So most states estimated would see most states that would see a reduction in funding probably have a larger share of the hold harmless amount than their school-age children population. For example, states with nearly identical shares of school-age children, such as Louisiana and Alabama, could see completely different results because, for example, Louisiana's share of the hold harmless was double that of Alabama's, and that just speaks to a lot of how favorable certain states had with those two expired programs. And actually, I think that's it. So, any questions?
All righty. Thank you, Mr. Jacobs, for that solid comparison of the potential funding and formula grant changes coming with the rewrite. I'm looking over here. I don't believe we've had questions come through the audience. One thing I was curious about, since all of our presenters here and our panelists here have been following the ESEA rewrite process, especially Professor McGuinn have definitely brought up several points of contest that are still undetermined. I'm wondering if one of you or all of you might want to chime in on maybe one indispensable ingredient of the ESEA rewrite process, or one compromise that you think is highly likely to come out of this conference committee process. Of course, it's all pure conjecture, so we won't hold you to it, but wondering if any of you all had a take on that so far.
Chris, you want to go first on that one?
Okay. I think there has to be some agreement around this whole issue of the authority of the Secretary and the degree to which they're going to allow or continue to permit the Secretary to have what many would consider unfettered access to the use of the waiver and the ability to really shape things over and above the law. And the fact, actually, they have not appointed conferees yet in either house. And my intelligence is that that's because they're still trying to work out what they're going to go to conference and come out with agreements around. conferees don't like to sit there and are not going to sit there and deal with a lot of the details. So the staff are meeting a lot now, trying to work out these things. And the conferees are not likely to be appointed until they're a lot closer to actually having some major issues which have to be dealt with at the level of senators and congressmen. But Pat, what are you picking up?
Well, one of the most contentious issues I alluded to is this Title I portability provision that's in the House bill that's not in the Senate bill, and this is for many Democrats who for decades now have strongly opposed private school vouchers. They view this Title I portability as sort of a backdoor way to kind of bring about a pretty large, potentially private school voucher program in the United States. So I think there's a pretty clear line drawn in the sands on that, both in House and Senate Democrats and even for the president as well. I think House Republicans, of course, really want this provision to continue in the law as it moves forward. So I think you're likely to see some sort of compromise there. When something like this emerges that's controversial that someone really wants to see get enacted, the sort of the easy solution or compromise is to develop a pilot program of some much smaller scale that gives the advocates a quote unquote win, but gives the opponents ability to sort of minimize the impact at least for now and kind of live to fight another day on that. I mean, the other big area I think is on the federal accountability piece. Which again, the House bill really dials back the mandate for states to take serious action to intervene in these persistently low performing schools. The Senate version dials back the current sort of level of NCLB federal mandate around accountability, but contains still more of a sort of pressure on the states than does the House version. I think that's another area where you may see compromise because it's a real priority for many of the key Democratic constituencies. Again, the sort of civil rights groups and the anti-poverty groups, and then the Obama administration has made it clear, as have many in the Senate, that's a really important piece that needs to be addressed. And again, a possible compromise there might be, splitting the difference somewhat and letting the states off the hook for interventions in a large number of the schools, like you saw under NCLB, and even under the NCLB waiver process, the administration allowed states to kind of focus on the bottom of 5% of schools, say, rather than the much larger number of underperforming schools. So you may see some kind of compromise around there, which would continue language requiring states to address the very worst of the worst, but a much smaller number than they're currently were responsible for under NCLB.
I think I would add that at some point there is going to be a change to formulas for Title I and II, and where they decide to land on certain percentage figures, that's yet to be determined. But I do think that it's, at least with Title II, getting rid of that hold harmless, some version of that will happen at the end of the day, because the holding states, holding those allocations to programs that haven't even been around for over 10-something years now is just certainly an issue. And then also, we do a lot of stuff with NGA and NCSL here at FIS, and they, at NGA at least, they really continue to press that they think that they will be able to get some sort of role for the governor in this bill, such that maybe the governor has some sort of ability to sign off on state education plans, and so we'll see what happens with that as well.
All right then. All right, thank you all for those additional insights. I don't see more questions on here, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. If there are additional questions that we're not able to get to, please send them our way, and we'll make sure to forward them to the appropriate presenter and follow up with a response at a later time. Thank you again to all of our presenters for their time and contributions. They were all great presentations and very informative. We'd also like to thank our CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her assistance with the technical aspects of the webinar. And if there's anything more that the SOC can do to assist you in your work, please don't hesitate to contact us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.